Okay. The new TMAA president, and I'm glad to see all your shiny faces here today, or at least your names on the screen. Today we have Jason Pawloski with us, and I have a little bio I was going to share with you about him. No, here we go. Sorry, hang on one second. I keep losing it. Oh no. I'm sorry. Every time I touch it to expand so I can read it without my glasses, somehow it goes away. Okay, you know what? I'm going to wing it. Jason Pawloski, RDN, is a registered dietitian with 15 years of professional work working with people on their nutrition and their physical health. And he's written a book called Foods for Thought. And he's going to share some of his knowledge with us about, and particularly about gut health and emotional well-being. Did I do okay, Jason?
Yeah, that sounds pretty on point. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, welcome. We're glad to have you here. And I would just say, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate the invite. And thank you, Sasha, both for having me today. And thank you, Texas Medical Association. It's an honor to be here with everybody today and just contribute to this important conversation. So I appreciate the introduction there. And what I want to talk about today is the topic is foods for thought, understanding the impact of food choices on mental health. So make sure and it's okay, there we go. All right, so some of the points I wanted to talk about today, just give a little bit of my background and explain how I ended up in this specialty of nutrition for mental health. Ultimately why I ended up focusing on and chose the social media handle mental health nutritionist. But then we got to dive a little bit into the science, talk a bit about some of the common mental health disorders that are linked with diet and specific key nutrients that are linked to each disorder. Then we got to talk a bit more about chronic inflammation and its potential, keyword potential, causative link with with major depressive disorder. And we need to look further at the gut health for brain health. I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that, but it's that strong link between our gut health and our brain health that we can't afford to ignore any longer. We need to further explain and research to understand this very intimate link we're talking about today. So getting to know your gut-brain axis, or even more odd of a term to many of us, might be the second brain. Maybe you've never heard of. A lot of researchers are now referring to that intestinal tract as our second brain. And then I try to tie this together at the end and some sort of solutions, crafting your foods for thought game plan is what I refer to it in my book. And just a full disclosure here, much of the research topics and the presentation that I'm talking about today comes directly from a personal area of interest, something I've been researching for the past about 2.5 years as I self-published this book. And notice that the title is almost the same as our presentation today. But in my book, I look more broadly at lifestyle, because we can't just talk about food and nutrition here. And that's something I realized when I started conceptualizing this book. I can't just talk about what we eat and how that affects our mental health if we're not acknowledging what our stress, how that affects our mental health, our sleep, basic self-care measures. So those are some of the important things also part of this conversation that I talk more about deeply in the book, but didn't really dive too much into in this presentation today. I want to focus more on the food choices. A little bit of my background here. My first clinical registered dietitian job, I worked down in Yuma Regional Medical Center, which is right on the border of California and Mexico and southwestern Arizona, where I taught 6 different specialty clinics, everything from bariatrics, weight loss surgery, to cancer center, child rehab services, endocrinology, to family medicine. I got to teach community nutrition classes, support groups, walking groups. So it was tremendous opportunity I had to build my clinical skills. But ultimately, after a couple of years, I really wanted to hone my clinical skills on one challenging population and become more of an expert, rather than feel like I was kind of juggling 5 or 6 simultaneously as I was in my first role. So I originally had my heart set on renal dietetics, and I wanted to work in a dialysis clinic. But in retrospect, I was sort of talked out of it by my colleagues on my way out. And I'm very glad, because I call it serendipity, where I kind of stumbled upon a position I had never considered, working in behavioral health. Now, this is a great opportunity because, I kind of stumbled in this position after I kind of changed my mind and realized I wasn't going to go into the dialysis center. And I found this position for a behavioral health organization in Arizona. And it all started to make sense to me, because there's not enough dietitians that are trained or specialize in mental health or behavioral health. There's a very limited focus on this in traditional dietitian academics. So this was a great opportunity to try to give back and grow more in this specialized field. Unlike diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, kidney disease, liver disease, there are no clearly established guidelines for nutrition for mental health. So I think this is, again, is an important conversation we're having today, but also it's a tremendous area of research that needs to be expanding moving forward. And we need to further understand this, because I think we're just years around the corner from developing some of those guidelines for nutrition for mental health and understanding that a little bit more prescriptively than we ever have in the past. So ultimately, I felt compelled to research and write more to help elevate the conversation and help others recognize this important food-mood link. And I was in a very unique position to do so, working for one of the largest behavioral health organizations in Arizona and being the first and only dietitian in that organization. So let's take a quick look at some of the mental health disorders groups that we're going to talk about today. And I first want to recognize that there are over 250 different mental health disorders, according to the DSM-5. But I want to try to focus the conversation on some of the more commonly diagnosed disorders and some of the more perhaps relatable disorders that we're talking about today. So we're looking at mood disorders, depression and bipolar disorder, anxiety-related disorders, and schizophrenia and other psychotic-related disorders. Some of the links we're going to explore today. So major depressive disorder. This is a problem that affects way too many of us in the United States and even all around the globe. If I remember correctly, it's about 16 million, over 16 million adults in the United States diagnosed with or experience major depression on an average year. So that's roughly about 6.7%, if I remember correctly, of adults in the United States any given year. So that's too many of us that are impacted by this major depression. Now, one key nutrient we have to look closely at, where we see the most robust science on this disorder, is omega-3s. So pretty hot topic lately, omega-3s. I'm sure everybody's heard of it. What are we talking about? They're a certain type of essential fatty acids that many of us might not be getting enough in our diet. And it's so critical for not just our heart health, our brain health, our mental well-being. So that's one of those key nutrients that we're learning so much more about, and its linked with depression and depressive symptoms. So what we are seeing in the research is that folks who have inadequate omega-3 intake, that is significantly linked with that chronic inflammation in the body. And though that's one of those major mechanisms that we have to explore more in research to help explain the link and how it's affecting the mood and mental well-being. Because when we don't control that chronic inflammation, that's when it might be opening up the door to some other more significant health problems, be it physical health and or mental well-being. So what we are seeing is that omega-3 supplementation is more likely to reduce symptoms in those who are deficient. So some other things we have to look at in research, because there's some inconsistency we have to recognize. But in terms of the correlations, it really is becoming quite robust it's leading some researchers to what they call the inflammatory theory of depression. So again, it's not necessarily just that correlation we are understanding, but might it be a causative factor? So again, the question mark is there because this is not very definitive in science. And again, I got to be careful with how I present this because a lot of what I'm talking about in my book and what I explore in the research is a lot of correlations. So we can't say cause and effect with a lot of that correlation research. But some researchers are beginning to do those clinical trials and beginning to establish that cause and effect, leading to the inflammatory theory of depression. So again, is that potentially causing depression symptoms for some folks? Important question. The answer is not so clear quite yet. Part of why it's not clear is because the inconsistency of findings in the research. So we have to consider the various sample sizes, the degree of depression, what medications are folks on that are included in these studies, but also the types of omega-3s. They're not all the same, and there's different types we have to look closer at in the research. For example, there's EPA and DHA, two different types of omega-3s, and research is showing that it's when folks are taking those higher dosages of the EPA, that's more likely to have those protective effects. Not as much finding those results with the DHA. So key detail we have to further understand as we continue to research this. Looking closer at bipolar disorder. So again, we see the evidence that's mostly pointing to attenuating those symptoms of depression. So we see the effectiveness for omega-3 helping reduce depressive symptoms. Unfortunately, we're not seeing much effectiveness or consistency of findings when it comes to the mania. So that's the other piece of bipolar disorder, folks who go from that depressive state to that manic state. So we don't really have much robust science in terms of attenuating those symptoms of mania, but the depression, that's a key piece of that might stand to be improved by dietary changes, and specifically focusing on the omega-3s. Among other nutrients and other factors, but this is the most robust piece of the conversation we have to consider and understand more. So again, the research suggests that it's that chronic inflammation that is explaining that link. So if we don't take enough of those essential fatty acids in our diet, that's likely to promote a state of chronic inflammation. So we really need to make sure we're getting those essential fats in our diet, help combat any underlying sense of chronic inflammation that might be contributing to poor mood or depression. Another factor we have to explore more in research is the gut dysbiosis. This is kind of a hot topic lately too. Basically all that means is that off balance of the good versus bad bacteria. And let me explain that a little bit. That might sound confusing, but we all have bacteria on and inside our body. Now, some of those different strains have beneficial effects to our health. Some of those strains might have harmful effects, while others are neutral. They don't have any notable effects. But what we are understanding is that we need that bacterial diversity to help fight inflammation, to help protect our immune system. So let me give you an example. Certain strains of good bacteria, and I use that term, in quotations because it's kind of vague to call them good bacteria, but it helps us understand. Those are those beneficial strains that confer benefits to the human host. So an example, certain strains produce short-chain fatty acids, and that's an important anti-inflammatory compound that helps combat any of that inflammation we might have going on in our intestinal tract and throughout our body. Also produces protective mucus. So certain strains of bacteria, it's almost like an extra layer of protection in our intestinal tract, supporting our immune system. So there's lots of reasons why we need to respect those good bacteria, those healthy bacteria within our gut, because that's such a key piece of this conversation. So moving on to the anxiety-related disorders, this was a little more challenging to talk about in the book and to find some conclusive evidence, because compared to some of the other links I talk about, it's relatively limited conclusive evidence of dietary links here. So again, I got to be careful with how I present this because we don't have much cause and effect evidence to really back this up, but a lot of correlation evidence, and it's really accumulating to the point where we are understanding it on a more intimate level as of recent years. Some of those key links we have to explore further that might help us understand how diet is impacting our anxiety or symptoms of anxiety are the neurotransmitters. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, and the blood sugar swings. And I would say in clinical practice, this is one of the most common problems I encounter on a day-to-day basis, or trying to help folks who maybe eat too much of those highly processed carbohydrate foods, but maybe they don't eat any whole grains, they don't eat much whole fruits, but they're drinking a lot of juice, eating a lot of white breads. So we really want to recognize the importance of that stable blood sugars, because those unsteady blood sugar swings might be contributing to those unsteady moods and energy throughout the day. Now, one of my favorite researchers, one of the foremost thinkers on nutrition for mental health, Leslie Korn, PhD from Australia, I believe she's lives in, researches there. Mood follows food, and mood swings follow blood sugar swings. So it kind of summarizes that strong association we're seeing there. But let me unpack that a little bit here. So the neurotransmitters, in order to produce them as normal, we need that steady supply of vitamins, of minerals, of amino acids that come from varied protein sources in our diet. And they help to normally regulate and produce those neurotransmitters that are key to regulating our mood. Now, also, I mentioned how important those gut bugs or those healthy bacteria are. Well, some of them, some different strains actually produce serotonin, dopamine, GABA, acetylcholine within the intestinal tract. So that's another key piece here. Those different bacteria, the diversity of bacterial strains that are helping to regulate that normal management of those key neurotransmitters. And keep in mind, those neurotransmitters help regulate our mood, our sleep, our appetite, our stress response, so many different aspects of our well-being. And that's what a lot of the psychiatric medications, they help to regulate those neurotransmitters. So let's look back at what we need holistically and naturally to just help us do that the best we can, and also using some of those other methods to help us manage whatever is needed for the individual. So do unstable blood sugars promote unstable moods? Again, question mark here, because the evidence is not so conclusive, but we can unpack that a little bit and recognize that the abrupt blood sugar spikes are more likely to lead to rapid drops in blood sugar. So again, that goes to the folks who maybe eat too much of those highly refined carbohydrates, a lot of juices, sodas, highly processed snack foods, too much breads and pastas, and not enough protein, not enough fiber, not enough healthy fats to balance out those blood sugar spikes. Now, how might that be contributing to our mood? Again, question mark. We can't say much about cause and effect there, but it's an important question we can't ignore. Now, in terms of the gut microbiome, so the first time I mentioned that term, but we were talking about the bacteria. The microbiome really just refers to that community of different bacterial strains. So the gut microbiome, we're talking about all within the intestinal tract, the different strains and community of bacteria within our intestinal tract is what we're talking about. So the established science is showing the links between that gut dysbiosis, that off balance, not enough of those healthy strains, and how that clearly leads to chronic inflammation over time, left unchecked. That is likely to disrupt those signaling systems that are necessary to help regulate and manage our stress hormones, our neurotransmitters. So ultimately, is that contributing to stress and anxiety? We can't say definitively, but it seems to suggest yes. Moving on to a little more troubling group of mental health diagnoses here. We're talking about schizophrenia and psychotic-related disorders here. And again, I got to be careful here, because I think this is one of the more challenging areas that, the research frankly is not that clear. But we still want to dive deeper into the research so we can understand this relationship more and help people perhaps manage their symptoms better, um, and find other solutions here. So looking broadly at the dietary habits and what we see as patterns of folks who have schizophrenia, and starting to tease out in research how that might be contributing to some of those symptoms. I looked at one major study here that was from researchers in King's College in London, and they compiled research results from 31 different studies that was looking at the dietary patterns and habits intake of people who had schizophrenia. And they found that folks with that disorder were more likely to have higher intakes of calories and processed foods, significantly higher unhealthy amounts of saturated fats, salt, and refined sugars. But it's also common for folks with schizophrenia to have inadequate intakes of fiber, of fruits, of vegetables, whole grains, and just that whole gamut of high fiber foods that is a key piece of this conversation. So again, that's not saying anything definitive right there, but we have to ask that question: how much is that nutrient depleted diet, that low fiber diet, how much is that playing into that disruption of that normal regulation of those neurotransmitters that are regulating our mood and mental well-being? Big question. Answers are not so clear, but hopefully over the next decade or so, those answers will become much more clear as different fields are specializing in this research and emerging to help us answer these difficult questions. So consider how a nutrient poor diet, I kind of just touched on this, might contribute to metabolic dysfunction and chronic inflammation. So again, it's that big picture here. Over time, when we have a disrupted metabolism and we have that state of chronic inflammation in the body, is that ultimately disturbing our normal regulation and maintenance of those hormones and neurotransmitters? So who has a higher risk for this problem occurring? Those who have lower intakes of essential fatty acids. So again, those are anti-inflammatory, so important for our heart health, brain health, and mental well-being. Also tend to have higher levels of pro-inflammatory compounds in the blood and more likely to have oxidative stress. So again, it seems to point back to that chronic inflammation and that lack of balanced diet that seems to be perturbing that normal metabolism, normal regulation of our body systems. So this ultimately can have a harmful effect on the normal function, metabolism, and may even disrupt the production and regulation of neurotransmitters. A couple more established links here, when it comes to psychosis or psychotic-related disorders. This can be onset by a variety of different conditions or related to different conditions, excuse me. But some things we do know in research is that severe deficiencies of certain B vitamins, such as B1 is thiamine, B3 is niacin, they can manifest as psychosis. So that's something we can't ignore. Again, it's the chicken and the egg. We can't say, is this causing psychosis? In some cases, it very well might be, but the answer is never that clear, unfortunately, with such a complex disorder we're talking about. But there's other B vitamins that we also have to take in consideration. B6, B9 is folic acid, B12. They're less understood in terms of the root cause of these mental illnesses, but we do know they're still critical for normal neurological health. And in some cases, they may partially explain the causes of psychosis-related disorders. So can't overstate the importance of just getting a varied and balanced diet that includes different sources of those foods that provide us all those different B vitamins. All right, so let's look a little closer at the relationship between our gut health and our brain health. So that might sound a little weird, gut health for brain health, but what am I saying here is that there's such a strong relationship, and over time, what is bad for our gut health and our digestive health, over time, more than likely, that is going to impact our brain health and our mental well-being. Quite the generalization I made there, but in the converse is true also. What is good and important for our digestive health in general is good for our heart health, for our brain health. So we have to respect that intimate relationship between our gut-brain axis is what this is referred to. Some researchers are even calling it the second brain. That might sound a little scary or weird. I get it. I talk about this in group therapy all the time, and there's usually a couple folks that just look really weirded out and confused when I start talking about the second brain. But what are we talking about here? The proper medical term is the enteric nervous system, and that is just generally referred to as the gut-brain axis, and that surrounds and supports or hidden within the digestive tract. Now, it's basically, we're talking about a complex system of over 100 million neurons that facilitates that communication between our intestinal tract and our main brain. So again, we can't afford to ignore this relationship between our digestive health and our mental health. So it communicates, so to speak. It's like that main highway of communication between our digestive tract and our brain health via the neurotransmitters and the hormones, those chemical messengers within our body. And our digestive tract also regulates our digestion, our absorption of food and nutrients that we need to, the building blocks to a lot of what we're talking about, but also the biological waste elimination. So we just want to respect how important our digestive health is for our mental health. Can't separate those two. So what do we need for good gut health? We'll start with some of the basics here, plenty of fluids and then fiber, but let's talk fluids first, because we need plenty of fluids just to keep that digestive tract functioning normal, just keep pushing things through, just to help deliver the nutrients in the blood to the working cells that need these building blocks that are required to produce the neurotransmitters, hormones, and overall regulating our mood and mental well-being. So plenty of fluids, one of the most basic, important things we can do to promote good health on a day-to-day basis. Now, just a quick look at these different foods. Now, what do they all have in common? We could probably say a few things. They're all very brightly colored. They are all plant-based whole foods, but the key thing I'm looking at here is the fiber. They're all rich, diverse sources of fiber here. Now, I put a little word of caution at the bottom there because we don't want to add too much fiber too quick if you're not used to eating these different high fiber foods. That can be uncomfortable for a lot of folks, especially if there's some underlying digestive disorders. That's when you need to strategize with your doctor, with the dietitian, to come up with a more specific plan for you. So there are certain underlying gastrointestinal disorders that might be a barrier to simply adding more fiber in your diet. So I just have to recognize that can be a challenge for a lot of folks out there with some underlying issues. But the fluids come first, because we just want to make sure we get enough fluid to push through all that extra fiber in our diet, and then gradually increase your fiber if you currently don't eat much fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, or just those beans or lentils or soy or tofu, or nuts and seeds. Those are all those variety of whole foods, plant-based, that provide us fiber. So a little bit of a break in the serious research here, just for something that I found on my travels the past couple of years that I thought was really awesome, and I had to add to this conversation, was a random sticker I stumbled upon in Atlanta, Georgia, and Chicago. That it's the same exact sticker: "Be smart, eat more fiber." So it's a simple but profound message, in my opinion, and it's directly related to this conversation. Because that fiber is one key piece of that conversation of normal digestive health, in turn, protecting our heart health, protecting our brain health. All right, so what else do we need for good digestive health? So probiotics is quite a hot topic. I'm sure most everybody's heard of that before. And probiotics, what we're talking about here are just those different strains of beneficial bacteria, those living bacteria within the food that when we eat them, they confer benefits to the human host, to our health. So in that picture on the left, there's just different fermented foods you see there. And I took that at a Korean barbecue place. So unfortunately, a lot of these foods are not as popular in the standard American diet. Many of us might not eat any of these foods or regularly, but they are a little more common in different traditional diets, such as like whether Japanese diet, Korean, different, quite a variety of different traditional or heritage diets where folks eat more regularly these sources of fermented foods. So those fermented foods are all going to provide probiotics. More commonly, we might go with the fermented dairy, whether that's a quality yogurt. Kefir is one of my favorites. It's like a liquid yogurt, and it's that fermented dairy beverage. So there's different sources you can try to work into your diet depending on what you like and what your dietary preferences or perhaps restrictions are. Prebiotics, that's another key piece of the conversation. Most of us have heard of probiotics, but I'm guessing not many of us have maybe heard of prebiotics before. So basically what that is different sources of fiber that we can't digest. Humans can't digest fiber, but those friendly gut bugs in our intestinal tract, they need it to do their job and to contribute to our health. So that's their fuel, those different sources of fiber to those healthy bacteria. Those are what we refer to broadly as the prebiotics in the diet. All right, so now how can we try to put this all together? Now, this is a challenging part of my book, is trying to kind of summarize this. This is part 3 where I try to kind of tie this together, cut through some of the confusion, because we can look at opinions of different doctors, different dietitians and PhD researchers. Sometimes they don't all agree on what is the healthiest optimal diet. So unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion still out there, I think in terms of what is the optimal diet. But my intention with the third part of my book was to cut through that confusion, try to boil this down to 3 key principles, but also what is the general consensus? What can all these experts agree upon that is as close as we can say to an optimal diet for our digestive health and our mental health? So understand everybody makes changes at their own pace, so I don't have any one size fits all here that answer that's going to work for everybody here. Some people prefer gradual changes. Others might be ready to dive into changes and, make drastic lifestyle changes. So we need to take time to craft an individualized plan. And I, one quote that stuck with me for this part of the discussion or book was, "A goal without a plan is just a wish." So let's become clear on what are your key areas for improvement are. What are the biggest areas for improvement that we can focus on and work on some baby steps. For most folks, I find that's what works. Baby step changes over time, that turns into something great. When we can build success with a few key changes in our diet over time, it's significant results. So forget diets, 3 guiding principles. Now, I just want to say a little pause on that where when I say forget diets, because, I say on this slide, diets do not work, but then a few slides later, I start talking about the anti-inflammatory diet, the DASH diet. So what I'm saying here is in the traditional sense and what a lot of folks mean when I hear the word diet, when they talk to me about diets, tends to be more the restrictive types of diets, cutting out and avoiding certain food groups, sometimes fad diets we're talking about. So that's what I mean when I say diets do not work, whereas the dietary pattern is more how I like to look at it, because although they might have the label as the Mediterranean diet we're going to talk about, the DASH diet, I like to refer to more as patterns. So it's not a specific diet to follow exactly, but it's more of a pattern to emphasize and get enough of key food groups and not too much of others. Also, too much of a good thing is not so good. So talk a little bit more about that. And keep it simple, plants are good. So plant-based whole foods is one common ground I find among the different healthy models of diets to look at. All right, so yeah, I kind of just explained that first point is that, by diets here, I'm referring to restrictive and or fad diets that might be helpful for people in the short run. They might feel like they got great success in that first month on some of those restrictive, prescriptive diets. And there's definitely some exceptions here. If a doctor or a dietitian recommends a particular clinical diet to you, there's probably a really good reason. And that's probably what's going to work for you for your unique condition at your unique time. But I want to take a step back and look more at the pattern of the overall diet we're eating. More important questions I like to ask people: how many fruits, vegetables do you eat per day, per week? Do you eat enough whole grains or different sources of whole grains? Do you eat different sources of essential fatty acids, enough of them? Do you eat a variety of lean and or plant-based proteins throughout the day and the week? So too much of a good thing is not so good, and I try to avoid those labels of good food versus bad food, because I push back when folks label foods that way, because I would say no foods are inherently good or inherently bad. It really depends on the context, and the unique health concern or condition we're talking about and the goal of the individual. So let me give some examples of what I mean by this. I think in terms of the carbohydrate foods, we know that eating too many of the carbohydrate foods can contribute to weight gain, to blood sugar problems. And that's why part of why so many folks do so well on a low carb diet in the short run, but rarely do I support somebody in the long run on those restrictive low carb diets, whereas they might have some utility, certain situations in certain periods of time. But particularly that point is true for folks who eat too many of the refined grains, like the white breads, flour tortillas, too much of the pastries, cupcakes, donuts, those foods that have a lot of the processed flours and sugars, refined grains, but they're lacking the fiber, lacking those essential fats and so forth. Another example of this point would be the proteins or meat. We all need protein in our diet, critical, for lots of reasons for our health. But we can get protein from a variety of sources. We don't necessarily need meat to meet our protein needs. Like many folks in the United States might be their primarily or only source of protein, or mostly eat that. So although it's essential for health, there's many Americans that eat far and above what they really need for good health when it comes to protein needs. And that's especially true for the animal-based proteins. So in other words, a little bit of meat goes a far way. A little bit of chicken, steak, burger, small amount is enough protein to give your body those amino acids, hold you over, balanced nutrition for that piece of the day. But sometimes if we go to a restaurant, they might give us really 3 times what we really need at that meal. And then if we fill up on that really big serving of meat, but then that displaces all those other healthy high fiber foods that maybe we're lacking. I think it's more that off balance and that displacement that is kind of the problem that we're looking at. Whereas we're finding that excessive amount of animal-based proteins in people's diets, looking at epidemiological and longevity studies, we are finding that it is strongly associated with higher risk of developing cancer, heart disease, and many other different chronic illnesses that kill the majority of us in the United States. So try to boil this down, keep it simple. One thing I think most experts can agree on is that, plant-based whole foods are good. And let me pause on that. I'm not here advocating a vegan or a strict vegetarian diet, as some people might misconstrue that I am. What I'm saying is that should be the base of our healthy, balanced diet, regardless of what healthy model we choose to follow. That's that one common ground that I find among these different model dietary patterns to follow. So for example, eat plentiful in a variety of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes is just that family of the foods, the beans, the lentils, peas, soy, and tofu. And then nuts and seeds. All those different whole food, plant-based foods provide us various sources of fiber and other key nutrients that are a piece of this discussion and a part of a healthy, balanced diet. So crafting your foods for thought game plan. First, again, I want to reiterate the importance of an individualized approach. And that's why I really struggled to give some concrete answers in the third part of the book. And it might feel like it's short on solutions in this part of the discussion, because it depends on what your key areas are for improvement. Maybe we need to start with basic self-care measures. Maybe that means working on your sleep improvement, starting to manage stress a little bit more, and then maybe move into the dietary changes. So what I'm saying is there's no one size fits all approach here. And, it's very individualized in terms of what are your key areas for improvement to help improve your diet and your mental well-being. Several things to consider before any significant dietary changes: time limitations. We might need to plan. I just heard an echo. I'm not sure if that came through. Okay. Budget restraints. So we need to plan more balanced and cost-friendly meal options for a lot of folks. And then cooking skills, kitchen access. That's a common challenge with the folks I help in clinic. They might have very limited kitchen access or live in precarious situations where they just don't have all those supplies that they need to prepare those balanced meals. We might need to strategize a little bit more. What foods appeal most to you? Again, let's try to enjoy this and find something that you're not going to feel too restricted, and find something that's going to work sustainably for you, not some quick fix solution that you're going to feel great about for a month or two and then get frustrated. So different dietary models that I look at and I commonly recommend to most of the patients I work with are DASH dietary pattern, and that just stands for dietary approaches to stop hypertension. And that is a model of diet that we often recommend in the United States to help people manage their high blood pressure or other cardiovascular diseases. So that's one model that might work for you. Or Mediterranean diet, depending on what types of foods you like. If you like more fish, you might maybe appeal more to the Mediterranean diet, for example. There's a lot of evidence that it shows it can help fight inflammation. And then also another more strictly plant-based whole foods model to look at would be the Power Plate, as you see on the bottom left there. This would be more geared towards somebody that wants to follow a strict vegan diet or strictly plant-based, that doesn't include those animal-based proteins, and it's just more strictly plant-based on that model. Anti-inflammatory diet, that's just another very comparable model, and once I start listing all these, the lines start to blur because there's really so much more common ground between all of these than differences. So I would say these are all just kind of different iterations of very similar, of almost the same principles we're looking at. It's that balanced diet, different essential fatty acids, lots of variety of high fiber foods, not too much of the processed foods, not too much of the saturated fats. So a lot of common ground here. Pick what works most for you, and these can all be great options. All right, so try to conclude here. Although diet may not explain the etiology or the root cause of many of these mental health diagnoses we're talking about, they are a key piece of the conversation. We can't afford to overlook it because a balanced diet can at least help reduce the severity of the symptoms about what we're talking about in many situations. And again, controlling the chronic inflammation through diet can help reduce symptoms of depression and likelihood of other illnesses related to that inflammation. So I can't overstate that importance, because there is the whole gamut of different physical and mental conditions that are strongly linked to that chronic inflammation. So many I didn't even begin to touch on today. So I can't overstate the importance of that link in research and continuing to understand and address that and controlling chronic inflammation within the body. Future research of the gut-brain axis or the second brain is likely to, in due time, in my professional opinion, it's going to revolutionize healthcare and psychiatry in particular. So let's consider the emerging fields of nutritional psychiatry, neuropsychiatry, nutrigenomics, metabolomics. Those are just key fields of focused science that are going to help unpack these links that we talked about and help us further understand and eventually come up with more guidelines for nutrition for mental health. And hopefully more clear answers than, and I hope I gave some answers today. And as far as the questions, let's open that up, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. So thank you very much for having me today. And it was a pleasure to join you all for this conversation. And I welcome any questions or comments at this time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jason. Anybody have a question or a comment or?
And I've placed everyone on mute, but feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question. Or you can put it in the chat box.
Yes. I had a question, Jason. You mentioned foods with B vitamins in them, and I don't have a good kind of Rolodex in my head of what foods are rich in B vitamins.
Yeah, so quite a variety. In general, some of the foods that are rich in B vitamins tend to have a lot of different B vitamins. So we're talking about different whole grains, some of the meats, different fruits. I'm kind of drawing a blank, in terms of what are the best optimal sources. Sometimes even I, as an expert dietitian, I sometimes mix up my nutrients and I have to go over my notes to kind of refresh my memory. But in general, it's going to be our different whole grains. Some of the meats are rich in, and some of the vegetables and fruits.
Okay.
You may have touched on this, but I don't think I heard it. But what are your thoughts on intermittent fasting?
Oh, yeah, this is such a fascinating area of research. And, even though I thought this very loosely fit into the conversation, I felt compelled to write about it. So I think it's chapter 5 in my book is all about intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, and supplements. So it's kind of that hodgepodge of topics that loosely fits into this conversation, but in terms of the science for mental health, it's very vague. So I didn't think it was appropriate to include it in this presentation. But to try to answer your question a little more concisely, I think there's so much area for to help us I think that as we continue to research it, we will understand that it might help us address some of like blood sugar problems, for example. So there is some evidence showing that it could help with insulin sensitivity. So that's one of the common problems that folks with diabetes or pre-diabetes, blood sugar problems, it's that insulin sensitivity that might explain a lot of that problem. So if we over time, we might be able to use intermittent fasting as a tool. That's the way I look at it, as a tool. And that's why I wanted my reader to answer that question. Is that tool helpful or is it harmful to you? It depends on your unique situation. There's definitely some populations that it's not recommended for. So we have to explore the potential disadvantages, the potential advantages, and then understand how moving forward that might be a tool to help people potentially lose weight, potentially reset some metabolic disturbances, problems such as insulin sensitivity. So ultimately I look at it as a tool, and I practice myself. You try at least like one 24-hour fast every few months. Quarterly I try. But there's no right or wrong way to approach intermittent fasting. It's just important to run that by your doctor and see if you are a good candidate, first of all, because some of those contraindications that it's not appropriate for everybody. But again, there's that potential utility that's fascinating in science to me, but the definitive answers are just not that clear. That's why I just try to, in my book, it present all the potential advantages, potential disadvantages, and I wanted my reader to decide, is it helpful or hurtful?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that question.
And we have a question in the chat box. What omega-3 supplement do you recommend?
I try not to name drop certain brands, but one caveat I would say for any supplementation is try to look for a third-party verification. Just because supplements are not regulated like pharmaceuticals are, there's not much. There's limited oversight, but there's not quite that robust regulation. So we don't always know for sure that supplement has that what they claim is in there. So there's that purity, that quality we have to take in consideration. So I always recommend look for a third-party certification. I suppose I will name drop one. The one brand that I personally use is Nordic Naturals. That's one example that I trust the quality and a third-party certification. So there's probably a variety of different brands that could meet that basic criteria, but then it's also the amount of the, of the omega-3, making sure there's enough. And then that EPA versus DHA we talked about earlier, making sure it has enough of the right types of omega-3s to have some sort of significance potentially.
And I have a question about supplements in general. I've read some things about nutrient absorption being kind of limited if you're taking something as a supplement versus getting it naturally through foods that you're eating. Do you think it's worthwhile to take supplements, or are there certain things that do absorb better in supplement form as opposed to through your food intake?
That one's hard to give a straight answer because, I think there are some exceptions where some nutrients can be better absorbed, whereas to your point, on the other hand, there might be some that are poorly absorbed. So it really depends on what else we're eating, what underlying medical conditions we might have in the first place. So as a dietitian, I first want to focus on balanced nutrition the best we can, and keep supplements as that supplemental piece of the conversation. But the more I dive into this specialty of nutrition for mental health, the more I am seeing this potential utility for certain conditions and certain nutrients that a lot of folks can very potentially benefit from, that simply aren't going to get enough in their diet, or maybe aren't going to absorb enough in their diet. So let me give you a couple examples. Omega-3 is one of them. Especially in Arizona, a lot of folks I work with don't eat enough fish. They don't like nuts and seeds. So they're frankly just almost refusing to eat enough of those omega-3 sources. To those folks, I tend to talk more about an omega-3 supplement. Magnesium is another example that I tend to recommend a little more regularly, because it's such a key nutrient for so many different reactions and health processes. We need magnesium for over 300 different chemical reactions in our body. And if we don't eat enough magnesium-rich foods, then the potential benefits far outweigh, in most cases, any potential concerns of taking a magnesium supplement. So I would say in many cases that can be very beneficial and is linked to anxiety levels and our ability to relax. So if we don't eat enough of those magnesium-rich foods, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, leafy greens, you might benefit from a magnesium supplement. And really the only limiting factor to consider there, or at least in the low to moderate dosages, the tolerable upper limit is about 420 milligrams a day. And once we exceed that supplemental level, then we're just more likely to experience some diarrhea. It turns into more of a laxative effect. So that's kind of that limit we want to take into consideration. But otherwise, the potential benefits, I think, far outweigh potential concerns of a magnesium supplement. Couple exceptions there, but other than that, I try not to focus too much on key nutrients, because I would say in clinical practice, a lot of that is oftentimes in the psychiatrist's hands and a little bit outside of my scope. So in terms of those B vitamins, that's where I see the psychiatrist more commonly recommending folic acid with certain medications they're taking, certain B vitamins that are more commonly recommended. But that usually I see with the B vitamins in clinical practice is more often managed by the psychiatrist and addressed first there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have just a couple more minutes. If anybody else has a burning question, it would be great to hear.
And I am going to drop a link to Jason's book on Amazon in the chat if you are interested in taking a look at. And one of these lucky attendees will actually get a free copy of it. So what I'm going to do is randomly pick a name from everyone who is in attendance today, and I will shoot the winner an email so I can get your mailing address to have it shipped out to you.
Yay.
Just a quick follow-up on the B vitamins there. I would kind of second what I said with the magnesium is that, well, B vitamins are water soluble. So if we do take a little bit extra in our diet, most of the time that's just going to push through in our urine, so that's not, rarely is that a concern to take, a little bit extra supplemental B vitamin. In few cases, that's why I say I usually defer that, and it's addressed first by a mental health practitioner, whereas I'm more that clinical dietitian that is expanding my research more there. But yeah, that supplemental B vitamins, are just a quality multivitamin with some B vitamins. In most cases, the potential advantage is going to far outweigh potential disadvantages.
Cool. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Jason, this has been very stimulating and makes me want to go Google a whole lot of things, and also, yeah, really analyze what I've got in my refrigerator.
Thank you for that feedback, and I really appreciate the questions and the opportunity just to be here with you guys today for this important conversation.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Continue the good work. Are you planning on pursuing a doctoral degree in your research?
I haven't much considered that. If I do want to go into teaching, then I would consider that, but I'm probably thinking that's more towards the latter end of my career, as I don't see that anywhere in the very near future.
Well, it sounds like you've really hit on an area that could use a whole lot more research, and we'll be looking for your name.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. This has been a great group, a really good turnout. Obviously, a topic that we can all relate to.
Well, thank you so much for your time and attention today. And just if there's any follow-up questions, I'm always happy to answer any. So just please let me know.
Excellent. All right.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Y'all have a good day.
Thank you.